it's the responsibility. And here's why it's so important. We can write a really good strategic plan. Let's write a great strategic plan on how we're going to expand whatever we do, wherever, in what market we're going to do. But if you don't have a high percentage of your people going to work every day, passionately executing against that plan, you're not going to maximize the output of that strategic plan. Now, fact is, right now in the United States alone, about 70% of people who work every day are disengaged or actively disengaged, which means you're only getting 30% of the value out of the people in your organization. That sucks. Our job as leaders is to create a culture where 80 or 90% of the people go to work every day and are passionately executing against the strategy.
Garry, welcome to Tools, Talents, and Techniques.
G'day, Dustin. It's good to be with you. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to this. Before we jump in, could you please give our audience a thumbnail of a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, for 25 years, I had the privilege and honor of leading WD-40 company, a San Diego-born company that's famous for that blue and yellow can with a little red top. I joined WD-40 in 1987 in Australia. I moved to San Diego in 1994 and then was given the opportunity to lead in 1997. About 3 years ago, I re-fired. I didn't retire. After 25 years of having that opportunity, I learned a lot. And the thing that I learned the most was that organizations and leadership have an opportunity to make a positive difference in the world by creating cultures where people go to work every day, they make a contribution to something bigger than themselves, they learn something new, they're protected and set free by a compelling set of values, and people go home happy. And that's not a bad thing, because happy people build happy families build happy communities, and happy communities build a happy world. So recently I published my new book, Any Dumbass Can Do It. Now, I must tell you something. Ass in this does not mean someone's bottom or posterior. In Australia, a dumbass is a donkey. And the reason I called the book what I did is that if you're brave enough and you'll understand the elements that have to be in place to build a great culture, you don't have to be a PhD professor to do it. Anyone can do it. So today, I help leaders build cultures of belonging where love, forgiveness, and learning inspire a happier, more connected world. I coach CEOs, about 8 or 9 of them now, and I'm also on a couple of boards. One of them is Gorilla Glue, a product based out of Cincinnati. So if it's stuck, use WD-40. If it's not stuck, use Gorilla Glue. I live here in, and I live here in San Diego with
All
my
right.
family. Yeah, that's it.
Well, we're going to dive into some of the details here, but I want to go back to the Garry Ridge origin story. So, and we don't have to talk about all the beginning, but because we're somewhat limited on time, but how did you first find the opportunity with WD-40? What was your first role with the company?
I opened a subsidiary in Australia. I got to know the brand many years ago. After leaving school, I was a management trainee, worked as a sales rep, got involved in marketing, and I actually worked for the licensee of WD-40 in Australia, and that's how I got to know the folks here in the US. And in 1987, the company was really looking at how do they turn up the volume on global expansion. So I was fortunate enough, after meeting all the folks here, they approached me and said, would I consider working for the company? And would I open the Australian subsidiary? So on July 4th, 1987, with a fax machine under my bed, I opened WD-40 Company Australia. And the next 6 months, we did all you need to do to set up a company. And then in 88, we started. And then I did most of my work up in Asia, actually. We were expanding the brand into all the Asian countries, lots of squeaks in China.
So a lot of what you're talking about as far as like leadership and building community, like, do you feel when you started with WD-40 at this time when you're opening up branches and you open the subsidiary, was this in your mind? Were you like a leadership focused person? Were you like sports or anything like that? Or was it just, oh, there's the opportunity in front of me?
No, I didn't know how to be a great leader. I was a In the disc profile, I was a turbo D, be brief, be bright, and be gone. So I didn't realize the power of servant leadership, but I was lucky enough, or I made a decision just after becoming CEO to go back to school. I went to the University of San Diego. I got a master's degree in leadership. That's where I met my mentor and very dear friend, Dr. Ken Blanchard, who wrote the book, The 1 Minute Manager. He is the guru of servant leadership. And for 2 years, I went to school and I really learned the attributes of being a great servant leader and I put them to work. So, no, I was truly not the servant leader. But I learned how to be, and I'm glad I did because that's the key to success in business is you're not there to manage people, you're there to help people really succeed, and servant leadership is what that is.
Somebody told me a while ago that you manage things and you lead people, and that there's a big difference. It sounds, trivial, but it's true. Processes and things you manage, but people are led.
You manage your bank account and inventory. You actually coach people. I believe it's leadership is about coaching. So yeah, we're on the same page, but our job is to help people step into the best version of their personal self. And when you're thinking about what has to be in place to build a great culture, it's pretty simple. Do you have an organization where people know and feel like they belong? Do you have an organization where people know and are shown what they do really matters? Do you have a high degree of psychological safety? So you've reduced fear by taking the fear of failure out and replacing it with learning. I call that the learning moment. And then are you a coach, not a manager? And finally, what is the safety rails you have around the organization? You talk about tools and techniques. One of the tools is, do you have a compelling set of hierarchical values in your organization that protect people and set them free? So, they're kind of the foundational elements that need to be in place: care, candor, accountability, responsibility.
So before you became executive, and retrospect, knowing what you know now, were there certain things that you were doing or that you came across that, I need to be better at this one thing, or if I could do this better? Were there specific things that you were looking for?
I wish there was only one thing but there's more than one. If we're on camera right now, right, I'll introduce you to this person. This is Al or Alec or Alice, the soul-sucking CEO of Fear Incorporated. And those that can just hear us, not see us, I'm holding up a doll that I put together. And here are the attributes that this sort of leader has that create these toxic cultures. Their ego eats their empathy instead of their empathy eating their ego. It's all about me, me, me. They're a micromanager. They have to have their fingers in everything. They think they're corporate royalty. Thou shalt bow down to me because I am this person of power. They love a fear-based culture. They're a master of control. They're a know-it-all. They have all the answers, even the wrong ones. They don't like learning. They must always be right. They hate feedback, and sometimes they don't keep their commitments. So there are just a bucket full of behaviors that create these toxic cultures that people don't go to work to enjoy themselves.
I love that you came prepared with props. That's amazing. So okay. So knowing that in your journey, and were there people along the way, any mentors? You mentioned Ken at USD, but were there people that you looked to as signposts of, oh, that person's doing it right, or I really like what this person's doing over there? I mean, you don't have to name names of anything negative for anybody. Who was the negative signpost? A little smile on your face, like if somebody came to mind. But are there people that you look to and said, oh, I want to do it like this?
Yeah, of course, and I think what we need to do is be aware of that learning. And, in my book, Any Dumbass Can Do It, I tell stories about people that I worked for as a young lad in Australia, whether it be working in a hardware store or in a sporting goods store or delivering newspapers, that when I reflected on my experience then, now I could see what I learned from them. So, I think you have to be aware of who is it. Dr. Ken Blanchard that I mentioned, the 1 Minute Manager, but other people. that your audience may know. Marshall Goldsmith, who wrote the book What Got You Here Won't Get You There. Fantastic book. It's the basis of my coaching work that I do now. I coach 8 or 9 CEOs right now. Simon Sinek, who's a good friend of mine, who wrote Start With Why. Chester Elton is a guy that wrote a book, Leading with Gratitude. And, there are so many opportunities out there for us to really benefit from the experience of others. So my tool that I would tell your listeners to and who are with us today is be aware, and you don't know it all. The three most important words I ever learned in my life were I don't know. And getting comfortable with those three words is very important.
When you mentioned reflection and writing your book, you were doing it. Is there any practices or techniques that you use to reflection, like journaling before writing the book? Because I know that that's its own process in itself. But is that something that you did prior to writing the book?
When I did my master's degree at USD, we did a process called writing your leadership point of view. Writing your leadership point of view is an exercise where you go back and you do reflect on people and circumstances in your life that have brought new learning to you. The other thing that I do every day is I have a little notebook here, and you can see my little notebook. On it, I have a little placard, and I've carried this placard around for years. And it says, am I being the person I want to be right now? And then it says, who is that person? Now, you might ask, why would I need to carry this around with me? Well, because I'm a dumbass, I forget. And not only that, you know, we have no right to take our leftovers to people. And what I mean by that is we could be in a meeting or in a conversation or a situation, and we come out of that, and next thing I'm going to meet with you. Well, what have I left in that room that I need to take with me to be the best person I am for you? So I have this little list here, and it says, who's that person? And it reminds me of, I want to be grateful. I want to be caring. I want to be empathetic. I want to be reasonable. I want to be a listener. I want to be fact-based. I want to have a balanced opinion. I want to be curious. I want to be a learner, and I want to throw sunshine, not a shadow. So a simple little notepad reminder that helps you center yourself to, who do you want to be to bring the best person you can be to the next person that you have to be with? Because at the end of the day, we're just these basic human beings bumbling our way down this pathway of life. And in the bushes are these thieves that run out and grab us. And they're thieves of envy and greed and short-sightedness and time. And we get into the bushes and we go, oh, I like it here a little bit. But if we don't get out of those bushes and back on the path, we'll never make it to our destiny. So, don't be ashamed of having things that remind you of who do you really want to be, because life will sometimes make you someone you don't want to be.
As an executive, and you have this mindset, you're going through this course, you're reflecting on who you want to be and how you're going to do it, the day-to-day interactions that you're expressing these values in your real life. Was this like an evolution that you started to find these methods? Because really, I mean, what you're saying in journaling and finding these specific things, how long did it take for you to say, like, oh, I'm seeing the fruits of this?
Building a great culture in an organization, you can't sprinkle fairy dust on an organization and change it. You can't sprinkle fairy dust on your behavior and change. Magic wand, you are now a great leader. It doesn't work. So you have to be deliberate. And I mentioned my friend Simon Sinek earlier. He wrote a great book, and in his book, The Infinite Game, and he he said culture equals values plus behavior. Well, I spoke to Simon. I said, Simon, you left a word off: consistency. So you have to determine, what are your values? What are the behaviors that you want to use in your life every day? And then you have to consistently exercise on those behaviors. I grew up in Australia. When I was in high school in Australia, my science teacher gave me a petri dish, and they said, we're going to grow culture in this petri dish. And they said the things that are important here is you've got to know what ingredients to put into that petri dish, but then you've got to feed the good ingredients, and you've got to be brave enough to attack the toxins as they get in the petri dish so they don't eat the great culture. So this is consistency. It's deliberate. You have to understand, what works and what doesn't work, and then you've got to be brave enough to execute it. And unfortunately, a lot of leaders protect their own comfort zone at the expense of other people's development. And what I mean by that is we don't want to have those redirection conversations or those learning conversations because we feel uncomfortable doing it. And most times we're uncomfortable doing it because we haven't set clear expectations between ourselves and those we have the privilege to lead. What do we expect from each other? And what would that look like if it walked in the door today? And how do I live up to it?
That prompts me. One of the people that I saw, one of the first times in my career, when I saw the person is at the head of the company, and I used to work for a publicly traded REIT, the CEO, I remember seeing he had this balance of confidence and humility, and it was the first time I saw somebody at that level, in my professional career that I said like they have it. Right, that's that thing. I don't know exactly what it is, and I don't think I had the words for it at the time, but then I started to think like, well, what are those actual why do I feel that way when they're around? Like, how are they behaving? Like, how are they talking? And how do I implement those characteristics in my own life? So being reflective and seeing those things and how values and your behaviors, having them and having to live to them. So they're not just words, but they're behaviors. And I love what you said, what you added about consistency of showing up every day and having those signposts and being able to reflect on those things and say, like, am I living up to these? I love that.
Leadership is a balance between being tough minded and tender hearted, and the genius is in the middle. If you're a leader and you're too tough minded, you create fear. People won't share with you. There's low psychological safety. If you're too tender hearted, you're not brave enough to be able to have those redirection conversations. You've got to care for people, but you've got to come in the middle and you've got to be a balance between being tough minded and tender hearted, which is really what it's about. And, I talk about in my book what I call the four pillars of a great culture. The first one is care. We love and care about our people enough, not only to reward them and applaud them for doing great work, but we're brave enough to have those conversations when we need to. Candor is no lying, no faking, no hiding. I believe most people in organizations do not lie. They fake and they hide. And the reason they fake and hide is because the leader is creating fear. He or she is way on that scale of being tough minded. Accountability is the next one, the next pillar. Are we clear? What do you expect from me and what do I expect from you? And how are we going to make sure that we really are clear about that? And then the next one is responsibility. How are we going to take responsibility, or how are we going to be responsible for what we do? And, we created something at WD-40 called the Maniac Pledge. Don't ask me why I called it that, but it is. And it's an antidote to what I call the na disease. And I'm pointing fingers right now because this is the finger pointing disease that goes on in companies. It's not my fault. It's your fault. You should have, I should have, who should have. So we created this statement called the Maniac Pledge, and it says, I am responsible for taking actions, asking questions, getting answers, and making decisions. I won't wait for someone to tell me. If I need to know, I am responsible for asking. I have no right to be offended that I didn't get this sooner. And if I'm doing something others should know about, I am responsible for telling them. And that's the antidote to the na disease because it puts the responsibility at the person. How many times have you been in a situation where someone comes to you and says, well, I should have known about that. Well, my answer is, what you should have known about. So instead of bottling it up and now coming to me and telling me you should have known about it, why didn't you go and ask the person who knew about it what they knew?
So did you come up with the Maniac Pledge? Was that your
It was a group effort, myself and one of my colleagues and a couple others. We developed it. Yeah.
all right? All right. So at WD-40, you're leading that, you're captain of that ship. Were there any moments that you can recall or you can think back on where not necessarily a crisis mode, where like a big decision had to be made, where a lot of what you cover and your mindset and your philosophy came into handy, where you're like, this is a perfect example of how this works.
Was there one time? There were hundreds of times. We were a public company. WD-40 is a public company. So, we have those sort of things that happen all the time. I don't bip, something's bipping there. I don't know what that is.
Sounds good on my end. I don't hear a bit.
Okay, good. But what it comes down to is if you have a hierarchical set of values in your organization that help you make decisions, those decision points will become very, very easy. So it's really important in an organization to have a hierarchical set of clearly defined values that protect people and set them free. So yeah, we had a lot of decisions we needed to make, but we always referred to our values as the way we made that decision. Our first value was we value doing the right thing. Our second value was we value creating positive, lasting memories in all of our relationships. So whenever we were questioned about a decision, the first thing we'd say, is this doing the right thing as defined by the company? Will this create a positive, lasting memory for our shareholders, for our people, for the communities that we live in, for the customers we serve? It wasn't always about making the decision about profitability, because sometimes we made decisions that didn't enhance profitability, but they were the right decision to make because it was the right thing to do for those that we served.
I love that. When you talk about creativity and giving people the space or the grace, the freedom to be creative, can you expand on that a little bit and just talk about like how do you do that? How do you take barriers or at least extend barriers for folks?
Well, the biggest barrier for creativity is fear. Let's all talk about what we failed about today. Well, that's not really going to work. So, what we did is we created what we call the learning moment. And the definition of a learning moment is a positive or negative outcome of any situation that needs to be openly and freely shared to benefit all people. So we would say to someone, if you've got a positive outcome, share it as a learning moment. If you've got a negative outcome, share it as a learning moment because we will benefit from that. Now, interestingly enough, for those who are in San Diego, they may know the history of WD-40, but if they don't, here it is. Back in 1953, there was a fledgling company down in Napa Street called Rocket Chemical Company. And Rocket Chemical Company was in the business of developing and producing chemical products for the aviation and space industry around corrosion and protection. There was a problem with the umbilical cord of the Atlas space rocket. The chemists got together and started to mix up formulas to solve the problem. Formula 1 didn't work, 5 didn't work, 12 didn't work, 15, 16, 17, 18 learning moments, 21 learning moments, 25 learning moments, 32 learning moments, 37, 38, 39 learning moments. The 40th formula worked. So WD-40, water displacement 40th formula, was developed because back in those very early days, were comfortable about having learning moments along the way, and each one of those learning moments improved the product to the next stage till it finally got to the finished product. And that's the blue and yellow can with the little red top that you see in 176 countries around the world now.
Yeah, that's amazing. But I got to ask you a question. Then maybe they're not a good answer for this. Maybe so. Is there a WD-41? Like, did you just stopped? Like it was like, hey, this is perfect. We're good.
Well, there's a range of products now called WD-40 Specialist, which are different types of products, but the original formula that was developed way back then is primarily the same formula as it was. We did new Coke WD-40. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
What the company did do over time is adjusted some of the formulation to take out volatile organic compounds, and when better and more environmentally friendly raw materials became available, we would adapt them to the formulation. Basically, the formula in its essence is the same as it was back in 1953 on September 23.
That's amazing. So as a leader and an executive and things that you're coaching, how much importance do you put on building the culture? As a leader, I'm sure it fluctuates. Like sometimes you got to focus on this, sometimes you got to focus on that. But in order of importance, like is the CEO or executive the chief culture creator?
Absolutely. Fish rot from the head. So, it's the responsibility. And here's why it's so important. We can write a really good strategic plan. Let's write a great strategic plan on how we're going to expand whatever we do, wherever, in what market we're going to do. But if you don't have a high percentage of your people going to work every day, passionately executing against that plan, you're not going to maximize the output of that strategic plan. Now, fact is, right now in the United States alone, about 70% of people who work every day are disengaged or actively disengaged, which means you're only getting 30% of the value out of the people in your organization. That sucks. Our job as leaders is to create a culture where 80 or 90% of the people go to work every day and are passionately executing against the strategy. That's when you maximize the output of the business and you do the right thing by the people because you show them they belong, you show them they matter. You're a coach, not a manager. You reduce fear, have high psychological safety, entrepreneurialism, innovation becomes hot. So, we have a big job to do. And that's why I do what I do now because, I think leaders need a wake up call, or a lot of them do, about, people, they talk about people mattering. So why are the statistics so absolutely horrible? Because leaders are not doing what they should do. Instead, they're talking to Alec, the soul sucking CEO, too much.
So about that doll that you made, wow, did you really make that, or did you get one? And wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So for those of you who's just listening, go to YouTube and check out the video because it's
Yeah, here he is.
there he is.
And I have miniature ones of these that when I speak on the subject, I throw them out to the audience. And it's amazing how many people ask me for them and they find their way onto people's desks somehow.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. So good thing you have experience in licensing and all that stuff. Um, so when people come to you and you're working with an executive, and where do you start? How do you usually begin the process?
I have them look in the mirror. Most executives, most leaders do not realize what behaviors they're executing that are creating bad cultures. So we start by looking in the mirror and we identify what leadership behaviors do you have that are not enhancing the culture of the organization. And I do that I actually use Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. We look at that. And then I ask stakeholders, people that they lead, tell me about Dustin. What sort of a leader is he? And this, well, he's a micromanager. He never listens to me, adds too much value. Really? And then we do a heat map and I show the heat map to the person I'm coaching. I say, this is who you say you are. This is who those that you lead say you are. Guess what? They're right. You're wrong. So that's the first part of coaching, is awareness. Then the next part is intention. Now we've decided which of these behaviors that we want to throw out and what do we want to do. And we go into a practice of, being aware of those and coaching through those. And eventually the leader changes their behavior. Now, any dumbass can do it. I did it because I had many of Alec's behaviors or the soul sucking CEO's behaviors. Until I was aware of what they did, I didn't know how harmful they were. So I deliberately changed.
Were there a couple that you could talk about, like some of the things that you were doing that were getting in your way?
I was a terrible listener. I had all the answers. That. So I had to learn to bite my tongue, listen, and take the input from other people. Absolutely. I'm sure I was a turbo D in the disc profile. Be brief, be bright, be gone. So I wanted to micromanage. So I was a micromanager. But then, as I went through my master's degree and had my learning, I used to eventually I used to introduce myself like this. G'day, I'm Garry Ridge. I'm the consciously incompetent, probably wrong and roughly right chairman and CEO of WD-40 company, and I need all the help I can get. And it's amazing when you admit you need help and how much of it you get from the people around you.
Well, Garry, you've been very generous with your time today, and I really appreciate it. Congrats on your success. I'm going to include your book and your website in the show notes. But before we take off, is there any last message you want to give our audience?
Life's a gift. Don't send it back unwrapped.
You're a pro. Very Rich. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.